Where do you call home? According to the definition of home as a noun, home is the place where one lives permanently, especially as a member of a family or household. Where is home for you? That's a question that people have asked me my entire life. And for me, it's very complicated to answer that. Because as a third culture kid, I was born in France, as I've kind of alluded to in previous videos. But then I moved to Egypt at the age of a couple months old, where I spent 15 years of my life growing up. Then I moved to Cambodia for 3 years, finishing off high school at international schools. Then I came to the US when I was 18, and then spent 7 years in California doing college, grad school, and then starting to work at the same time. Then I moved to Maine for some weird reason because I just wanted a fresh start and to just experience a different part of the country, where I spent, I think, close to a year. And then after that, I moved down to the DC area because it was relatively close by and I found a job, and I've been here ever since, so about 1.5 years. So the definition of home has changed very drastically for me because I'm in a state where I am constantly moving every so often. I am experiencing new cities, getting new jobs, exploring different locations, and meeting new people. So they say home is where the heart is, but the definition of home is influenced by a large variety of factors, or at least I have found that to be so. So for example, you ask, let's say, like a couple of people in a room where home is. One person would respond, home is where I was born, and that's where I identify as. For me, that would be Toulon, France, but I don't really identify with that despite also being half French, which is an irony. Another person might say, home is where I have the most friends. And so for me, my friends have all dispersed across the world. Not boasting, that's just a fact. Like, I have friends in Singapore, Japan, Korea, Brazil. It honestly, like, they've spread all over the world. And it's very interesting because my friends have displaced themselves like all across the world, doing their own thing, having families, exploring jobs. And I don't have a specific location where I have a large number of friends to call home. So let's skip that for now. Another person may say, like, home is where my parents are or where I have the most family. So for me, that would be Cambodia because that's where my parents live, and then California because I have family over there as well. Oddly enough, I used to call Cambodia home 5 years ago because I was going back and forth visiting my parents. But that was also before I kind of started my own journey, like going into college, grad school, working, becoming my own man, that type of thing. And so Cambodia is not really home for me anymore, despite like my parents still living there. And so some others may say like home is where my job is. And so I identify with that to a certain extent because the job has defined the location that I've lived in, right? Like for example, I was in California when the pandemic hit. I was in Maine for my job, and I'm, in DC because of the job that I used to have. I've shifted over to new areas and stuff like that, but the embassy life in DC stuff is also partially responsible for that as a byproduct of moving here. So home for me is the DC area, but that's not because of my job. It's because I identify the most with this city, which is an interesting sentiment to have despite me living like all over the place. And I feel as if it's because I've grown over the past couple of years into an individual that wants an international place to live. And I realize there's a certain amount of irony saying that because like, oh Nate, you lived in Egypt and Cambodia, like surely that's international. Yes, it's international in the sense where it's overseas, but I'm talking about the overall ambiance and experience, and that's still not a good answer now that I think about it. The way that I relate to DC is a very interesting one. DC is an international city. You have so many ethnic groups that live in such a small area. You have, of course, all of the embassies that live there as well, with all 175 of them and the 20 plus cultural centers that I constantly visit. And so maybe I identify with the idea of DC being home because primarily of the embassy stuff that I've grown to enjoy. But then there's also the international culture here in the city where you could go to different neighborhoods and you experience like different, ethnic groups that are all over the place, different restaurants, different people that you talk to. And so I think I identify the most with DC because of my backgrounds growing up internationally. It's a very interesting sentiment. And so for me, DC right now is home, and of course a large portion of that is the embassy life and DC stuff that I'm currently doing. But again, it's like home is where the heart is. I resonate the most with DC, but as an adult, not as a kid. You see what I mean? When I was a kid, I didn't really think of home in like one specific location. Like my parents were always with me, right, growing up, and so that's what I thought as home as. Like, oh, we're in Egypt, that's home, but I had my mom and dad. Oh, in Cambodia, that's home, but I had my mom and dad. And then when I moved to California, I have family over there, so that's where home is. You see what I mean? So like the definition shifts over time to incorporate multiple aspects and fields, which is very interesting. So for me, home is in DC, and the definition has changed as I've grown up from a third culture kid into a third culture adult. Who knows? It may shift. If I ever move again, ideally I would like to. I don't want to stay in DC for the rest of my life, but I'd still want to use DC primarily as a home base. So, where do you identify as home?